Next, a look at the challenges facing Syria and the Middle East with Ribal al-Assad, a first cousin and opponent of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. He talks about Russian influence in the region, the fight against ISIS, and what he sees as the most likely outcome to Syria's civil war. Ribal al-Assad is founder of the Organization for Democracy and Freedom in Syria. He spoke at the World Affairs Council of Palm Beach.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ms. Celeste Simon, for inviting me, and I'd like also to thank Mr. Doug Evans and Carol Jagger for this amazing opportunity. It's really a great honor and pleasure to be amongst all of you distinguished guests. And I should start with a warning that despite my foreign upbringing and my liberal views, I have some positive things to say about President Donald Trump. I appreciate that he's not fashionable in many parts of the world right now, but please bear with me. Your president is, of course, now a year into his first term. The result of elections that were entirely democratic is a little baffling to many. As a Syrian, exiled from my country of birth for my entire life and whose children are yet to see their father's homeland, I pine for democracy and have dedicated my life into achieving it in Syria. It was not so long ago that this war-torn state was the most diverse and forward-thinking in the entire Middle East. Its people celebrated the country's unique range of religions and ethnicities, and people of different faith lived together in an atmosphere of tolerance and harmony. How we, the peaceful majority, yearn for a return to those times with one difference: democracy replacing dictatorships. And how we should celebrate any fair and democratic elections, even if the winner was, let us say, a little free with his hashtags. However, to understand Syria is no longer simple. It has become a hotbed of extremism and the scene of proxy wars that have raged for many years now, so much so that even the press is beginning to understand them. To truly understand what is happening there and what must be done to solve it, we must take a high-level view and see the crisis as a culmination of three levels of trouble. There are internal Syrian issues, those of the wider Middle Eastern region, and then the Cold War, whose impact is growing by the day. These three tiers of conflict are interlinked. What began on the street of Syria as part of the long-forgotten Arab Spring, with peace-loving Syrians calling for freedom and genuine Western-style democracy, became a honing ground for a proxy war being fought out by the regional powers, including Iran, Turkey, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia. This was a region already crucially important to geopolitical and economic events, and the growing enmity between Russia, China, and the West has added yet more complexity to the apocalyptic situation in Syria. As a result, the crisis spreads like a forest fire, sparks flying across borders and igniting new problems. You will have heard about the Lebanese Prime Minister Hariri, who recently announced his resignation on a visit to Saudi Arabia, prompting the US Secretary of State to warn the regional power brokers in the Middle East to stop using Lebanon as a proxy battlefield. To the southeast of the region, you will also know about the horrific civil war in Yemen that is creating a new humanitarian disaster, as well as further political instability and sectarian bloodshed. And just yesterday, former President Saleh was murdered by his former allies, the Houthis, who are doing Iran's dirty work as she looks to gain greater hegemony in the region. Meanwhile, terrorism thrives, largely thanks to the huge areas of the Middle East that exist in a political vacuum, enabling extremism to attract the disillusioned, train them quite openly, and then send them armed with instructions to kill. The dogma of Islamism also travels fast and poisonously across the internet, inflaming individuals to act in areas that are apparently safe and secure. These incidents in the West, from Brussels and Paris to London, and of course here in the United States, receive the majority of news coverage. But there are incidents almost daily across the Middle East and Africa, and most recently in Egypt, that are causing mass casualties. And every casualty breeds more division, more animosity, and more dry wood on that fire of conflict. The world is not short of problems. The financial crisis instigated global intervention. So quite rightly has poverty and slavery, as has climate change. But when it comes to the global phenomenon of poisonous Islamic extremism, the world is either unwilling to help or divided on how best to do so. And while this indecision has reigned, the crisis has been accelerated, leading to the greatest humanitarian crisis of the modern age. I spoke about this for many years in vain, but there are renewed ground for hope, and that hope has coincided with the arrival of President Trump. Under the previous administration here, there was a complete lack of understanding of the Syrian conflict. Successive secretaries of state publicly supported what they describe as the moderate opposition to the regime. Sadly, this was a myth. These days, when liberal, peace-loving Syrians waving flags in protest at the government and calling for peaceful democratic change has long gone. When ISIS thrived, the supposedly moderate opposition was actually made up of groups fighting alongside al-Nusra, which is actually al-Qaeda's branch in Syria. Remember them? Yes. They say that fact is stranger than fiction. But the West was actually sending money and equipment to be used by the same group that was directly responsible for 9/11. And yesterday, the BBC investigative program Panorama found that taxpayers' money in the UK has been diverted to extremists in Syria. No one in this room should be surprised. And General Petraeus openly suggested that the US should support al-Nusra to fight ISIS, but the Twin Towers were brought down by al-Qaeda and not ISIS. Fortunately, that bizarre and flammable support has ceased. Your new administration quite rightly speak about the need not to pick and choose Islamist groups to fight, but to destroy all extremists who share the same perverted ideology and a single desire to bring death upon others, including the Muslim Brotherhood, whose sinister modus operandi has been tolerated and ignored for so long. So the US now has a simple strategy: to unite forces with other global powers in the greater fight against the Islamic State and every other group that shares its poisonous dogma. Trump's administration has also benefited from President Obama's instruction to the Pentagon in almost his final act in the White House to target leaders of al-Nusra, the Syrian affiliate of al-Qaeda. I, like so many of you, I am sure, wish Obama well. And so I will give him the benefit of the doubt here and agree that late was certainly better than never. So although the Middle East is still an inferno, and although peace is a distant prospect, at least we have now prioritized our enemies. And as we look to bring security to the world, we need to understand three simple but crucial truths. Number one, Islamic extremism is not a local issue. It threatens every peaceful citizen of this planet, from Australia to Austria and from New Delhi to New York. There may be many brands of Islamism, but they all share a single objective: to establish a caliphate under Sharia law, stretching from Xinjiang in China to Andalusia in Spain, and indeed any country or even city where they believe Muslims are the majority. To that end, they will commit atrocities not only in Syria and Iraq and across the MENA region, but as we have witnessed in Russia and China, as well as Europe and here in the United States. We have seen this again and again. There is no point in the global superpowers arguing about other issues when they share this existential threat. There may be characters in Russia and beyond who we find it hard to empathize with, but at least we can understand that they are rational players with clear interest and room for compromise. Radical Islamists have no rational agenda, no people to protect, no boundaries to secure, no trade balance to improve. They have no diplomatic network, no measurable army to contain, and no interest in peace. Focusing our defense against our traditional enemies in this environment is like sending message via carrier pigeon in the internet age. Don't take my word for it. Hear the words of former UK Chief of Defense Staff, Lord Richards. And he says, and I quote, "It's non-state actors like ISIS that are the biggest threat to our security. It's a lack of understanding and empathy with each other as big power players that is a risk to us all at the moment." Yes, there are many reasons to dislike Russia's stance in Syria, her blind support of the brutal regime, including her plan to decide the outcome of the conflict by creating a new non-representative opposition group working solely in the interest of the regime and in Moscow's. But I argue that she would have had no need to do so had the West always approached Islamism with its current sharp focus. To return to my analogy of fire, the US and Russia taking different stances in the region had been like blowing oxygen onto the troubles, allowing the flames to burn even stronger in defiance of each other, rather than working together to throw water. Finally, that coordinated effort is happening, and the result on the grounds have been swift and positive. So the superpowers must prioritize and continue to work as one, but that is only our first issue. The second is to encourage a genuinely secular, liberal and democratic opposition movement in Syria, a process that requires engagement rather than saber-rattling. And yet, the Middle East is in crisis. The superpowers have not just been disagreeing on the best way to deal with the problem, they have contributed and continued to clash elsewhere, with Russia and China threatened by what they see as US encirclement. There is a new US missile shield in South Korea, with which event further north, looking increasingly dangerous, becomes strategically more significant. By the way, my theory is that the extraordinary pace of North Korean missile development since the ascendancy of Kim Jong-un could not have happened without active support from another major power. Lieutenant General Viktor Pozintkhir at the Russian military general staff referenced in terms befitting the Colosseum. And he said, if one of the gladiators takes up a shield, it will give him a marked advantage. What would another gladiator do? Naturally, he also would pick up a shield and also a longer and stronger sword. This is what's happening now as a result of the US missile development. 60% of the US Navy is now based in the North Pacific, and naval maneuvers are common in the South China Sea. And Admiral John Richardson, Chief of Naval Operations, announced that traditional no-go zones around Russia and Chinese coastlines will no longer be respected. Hardly a helpful context for an integrated approach on Syria. The aggression is, of course, not one-sided. Japan joined the US Navy in trade patrols, and China responded as recently as November by sending a fleet of fighter jets and bombers close to Japan's Okinawa Island. The Chinese has also tested ICBMs and hypersonic missiles, and Russia is increasingly explicit in its support. Russia was aggrieved by American warships entering the Black Sea earlier this year and by the development of US missile bases in Eastern Europe, described by President Putin as yet another step to rock international security and start a new arms race. No surprise that earlier this year, Russia deployed nuclear-capable Iskander missile on the Polish border, and the Russian naval flotilla approached Syria, including 3 submarines and their only aircraft carrier in the Mediterranean. Meanwhile, she deployed S-300 and S-400 missiles inside Syria. Russia is also following the US by increasing its presence across the world. And just last month, Viktor Bondarev, the head of the Russian Upper House Defense and Security Committee, suggested that a natural response to US aggression would be to reopen bases in Cuba and Vietnam. The Russian and Chinese do not see Syria as in any separate events from Ukraine to the Pacific. The West must understand this bigger picture and cease to treat these issues independently. The arms race is escalating at its faster rates in the 1980s, but with multiple players. There is an increasing chance of bluffs being misinterpreted and therefore of a potentially disastrous preemptive strike. It is no exaggeration to speak in terms of a new Cold War, quite the opposite. And the German Foreign Minister Frank-Walter Steinmeier told Bild a year ago, it's a fallacy to think that this is like the Cold War. The current times are different and more dangerous. And until the recent collaboration over policy in Syria, there were moments, including the threat of direct action against the Syrian regime, when cold very nearly became instantly hot. You will notice that my second suggestion for the development of a Syrian democracy focused on events elsewhere in the world. And this is the reality. We can all talk a good game, but there is no hope for anyone inside Syria until the global powers start to work together. And I ask any of you if it's possible to develop strategy pursuing peace and harmony in one region when sabers are being rattled increasingly loudly in many other areas. I believe ever more strongly that the West should take a lead by de-escalating tensions and talking to the Russians and others about how to make progress. The third and final thing we must do is to understand why things are developing as they are in Syria, on the ground, not just from our perspective, but from that of the people inside the region, who must understand the vested interest of all global powers who wish to redraw the map of the Middle East. Each has fear of influences to consolidate, and the people of the region must take responsibility for taking control and determining their own future. Let's turn the clock back to the end of the first Iraq War, where maps were drawn up with countries in the region divided into smaller states on ethnic, sectarian, and religious grounds, alongside a greater Kurdistan. And surprisingly, and even though parts of their own nations were divided, Turkey and Iran were both happy with this. They believed they could control the outcome, with Iran becoming the leaders of the Shia Arabs and Turkey the leaders of the Sunnis. After all, both are authoritarian Islamist regimes, albeit Sunni and Shia respectively. So they clashed only over the specific arrangement required to give Iran access to the Mediterranean through Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, and Turkey access southward to the Gulf to form a kind of a new Ottoman Empire with access to oil and gas in Sunni eastern Syria and western Iraq. But Turkey has only just understood that it was never actually considered a partner by its Western allies in the new Middle East, just a tool to help bring it about. They did not understand until recently that the new Kurdistan would not only be in Iraq and has become apparent more recently in Syria, but would also include the Kurdish part of Turkey, which would mean losing territory and having a hostile neighbor. This is why they have begun to see the Kurds as an existential threat that they must fight beyond their borders. No wonder President Erdogan recently said something that would have been unthinkable 5 years ago. He may speak to President Assad as they are both fighting the same enemy. Hence the fight to the death against the Kurds that President Erdogan pursues outside his own borders, and he had warned the Iraqi Prime Minister that Turkey feels it has the right to take his fight wherever they must. At the start of the Syrian conflict, Turkey and Russia sat on opposite sides. But despite this shooting down of a Russian jet, followed by hard-hitting sanctions from Russia and the Russian bombardment of Islamists on the Turkish border, President Erdogan and Putin demonstrated realpolitik in action. The Russians cultivated the Turk, whose army is the second largest in NATO as an ally, giving Turkey permission to enter Syrian territory to fight the Kurds and keep the US in check. They have also signed a deal to build a major gas pipeline under the Black Sea, and Putin helped Erdogan avert a coup just last year, which the Turkish president believes was masterminded by the West and the US specifically. In fact, last Friday, Turkey's chief prosecutor issued an arrest warrant for former CIA officer Graham Fuller for attempting to overthrow Turkey's government. Not so long ago, Turkey has been lined up for membership of the European Union. And President Erdogan more recently said that if full membership is not offered, then it is the end of the game. Turkey wants to have its cake and eat it. And the EU has called her bluff. And just last week, she withdrew approximately $200 million of funding to help prepare the country to become a fully fledged member, which will not disappoint Syria's watchers in Europe, who have seen Turkey backing extremists in Syria from the very start, including ISIS, from whom she bought oil. This is no secret. The leader of the Turkish opposition, the People Democratic Party, Selahattin Demirtas, has criticized Turkey's dealing with the Islamic State. And Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Yaalon is on the record stating that Turkey has paid ISIS for oil. But why should we be surprised? President Erdogan's Justice and Development Party stems from the Muslim Brotherhood, which it continues to support. Don't be fooled by Erdogan turning on ISIS. It has long supported and continues to support extremist groups, including al-Nusra. And Erdogan himself said many years ago that democracy is a train we ride to reach our destination. He was also jailed for saying that the mosques are our barracks, the domes are our helmets, the minarets are our bayonets, and the faithful are our soldiers. Hardly the words of an elected leader of the Western world. Under his leadership, liberals have been persecuted, and up to 5,000 jihadists have been given free passage to Syria and Iraq, many returning under the guise of refugees to spread terror back home. This has long been recognized by key players from the Obama to US Defense Secretary Ash Carter. And if you need further proof, King Abdullah of Jordan, a US and Western ally, explained to US Congress that Turkey was sending Islamist extremists to Europe as a matter of policy. David Davis, British cabinet minister, currently leading negotiations to leave the EU, quoted the Muslim Brotherhood Yusuf al-Qaradawi as seeing Islam's peaceful conquest of the West taking place through membership of the EU. In fact, many of my own English friends who voted for Brexit did so not for economic reasons, but because they did not want to share membership with Turkey. 2 weeks ago in Washington, lawmakers drafted a letter calling on Rex Tillerson to designate the Muslim Brotherhood as a foreign terrorist organization. This comes only on the back of a bill introduced by Senator Ted Cruz proposing the very same. And President Erdogan has, of course, objected to these. And just last summer, he published satellite information detailing the position of all US military positions in northern Syria, which has, of course, angered the US and directly leading the Pentagon to admit it has 1,500 more troops on the ground than the 500 it had previously declared. Erdogan remains a danger to any potential peace. He cannot be trusted. But there are others within his regime who offer some grounds for optimism. They include Prime Minister Binali Yildirim, who seeks to act as a catalyst in bringing together the US, Russia, Turkey, and Iran to put an end to the bloodshed in Syria. Russia, meanwhile, is currently allied with Turkey and Iran, but she has ulterior motives without truly wanting either to succeed. And so she has courted the Egyptian government in Egypt. Yet, wherever you look, Russia is involved. She has benefited from a vacuum and a clear strategy and a prioritization of enemies. The West must recognize this and learn from her past mistakes. What were these? Again, there is no rocket science involved in identifying them. The first was supporting the wrong allies in Syria. Hillary Clinton took 18 months to realize that the so-called Syrian National Council did not represent the Syrian people, but was a Turkish-backed front for the Muslim Brotherhood. Those were the 18 months in which Syria Spring transformed from a peaceful protest into rivers of blood. Lessons learned? Sadly not. The West transferred its support to the Syrian National Coalition, formed in Qatar, which still included the Muslim Brotherhood, but added more Islamist groups to it to please the Saudis. And its representation on the ground was the Free Syrian Army, whose supreme military council was exclusively Salafi Wahhabis. It's now 4 years since Eric Holder confirmed that the Free Syrian Army was led by and spreading the philosophy of al-Qaeda. And General Lloyd Austin III was chillingly accurate in his forecast that, left unchecked, the spread of violence and terrorist activity emanating from Syria could result in a long, drawn-out conflict that extends from Beirut to Damascus to Baghdad to Yemen. Well, that's where it is now. Despite John Kerry's having bizarrely claimed there was absolutely no al-Qaeda presence in Syria after its existence had been long established. Mistake 2, branding. If you wish to save the world from obesity and discover that the magic solution is to be found in banning sugar drinks, you won't get very far if you only ban Pepsi. And have the rest to continue much as they did before, particularly if you actually fund some of their competitors. Absurd, and I know that, but that's what the West did for too long in Syria, claiming that to go to war in Islamic extremism when in fact it was only fighting Islamic State. Meanwhile, other equally cancerous groups from al-Nusra and Ahrar al-Sham, al-Hazm Brigade, and Nur al-Din al-Zinki movement to Jaish al-Islam and Fatah al-Islam were allowed to operate as before, and in some cases were even given US backing. We do now appear to be defeating the group called ISIS, but they are the effect, not the cause. Extremism is rife, and we cannot defeat it by targeting any one group or brand. We must defeat the entire ideology, first on the ground, and then, more significantly, in the longer term, we must win the battle for the heart and minds of the poor, the disadvantaged, and the afflicted. Because if we can produce a positive alternative, the allure of any Islamism, with its apparent benefits, including a sense of identity, will be impossible to handle. But how do the extremists maintain their huge expenditure on weapons, training, and an extraordinary effect presence on social media and the internet? Well, let's go back 3 years for the answer. Because that was when WikiLeaks cables revealed, and I quote Hillary Clinton here, "The government of Qatar and Saudi Arabia are providing clandestine financial and logistic support to ISIL and other radical Sunni groups in the region." She also stated that donors in Saudi constitute the most significant source of funding to terrorist groups worldwide. Also in 2014, Vice President Biden explained to students at Harvard University that our allies in the region were our largest problem in Syria. He explained how they had started a proxy Sunni war in a bid to bring down the Syrian regime by funding and arming groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, al-Nusra, and the Islamic State. Incredibly, the Vice President was later forced to apologize for these comments. The second in command of the most powerful country in the world apologized for telling the truth, when in fact he and the administration should have been acting on it. Qatar was identified directly by Sir Malcolm Rifkin, the former chair of the UK Parliament's Intelligence and Security Committee. He pointed out its role in promoting terrorism and insisted that Qataris must choose their friends or live with the consequences. Saudi Arabia poses a more complex problem. It has long poured millions of dollars into support for global terrorism. And Bernard Squarcini, a previous head of France's counter-espionage and counter-terrorism intelligence agency, had pointed to Saudi intelligence supporting extremist groups from Afghanistan to Lebanon and Syria to Egypt to Mali. But this is hardly surprising given the kingdom's own political culture and fundamentally Islamist. ISIS and Saudis share a particularly extreme form of Wahhabi Salafi Islam, which explained the regular news reported of death by beheading and stoning for relatively mild offenses. And last year, an al-Nusra commander explained to a German newspaper that his group was receiving US weapons via third states. This is positioned as opposing the Syrian regime, but on the basis that humanitarian aid to Syria is being stopped from some countries because it is siphoned by extremists, it is not surprised that weapons are falling into the hands of terrorists. Russia actually challenged that. Not least because the group's backers in the Gulf states told them to carry on fighting alongside al-Nusra. And if we remember in 2014, when the US government invested $500 million to create a new rebel force in Syria, the beneficiaries ended up fighting alongside al-Nusra, all 5 of them. Yes, as General Austin admitted to a US Senate committee, that was the precise number of fully vetted rebels trained by the states. That's $100 million per soldier, which is quite some apprenticeship program. Imagine the impact if that money had been directed towards schools and hospitals in Syria. Now fast forward to 2017. And worryingly, the BBC published a detailed investigative last week demonstration how, in the ruins of Raqqa, hundreds of ISIS fighters and their families were allowed to escape right under the gaze of British-led coalition and Kurdish-led forces. They were taken out in convoy and then set free. This came only a month after the Guardian newspaper reported something identical on the Syrian border with Lebanon, where the Lebanese government and Hezbollah allowed ISIS fighters to return to Syria. There are pictures of them being taken on coaches like the supporters of a football team. Russia expected a Clinton victory a year ago. She feared that the West would continue to support certain extremist groups and accelerated her involvement on the ground accordingly, making significant gains. Since the understanding with the new administration here, she has gained more and more ground from Deir ez-Zor to Al-Bukamal, defeating ISIS in eastern Syria, if only this collaboration had taken place 5 years ago. It is this context that we return to President Trump and a clear change in strategic direction. The president may not communicate in most subtle way, but he gets to the points fast, and he understands that choosing between Islamist groups is akin to choosing a terminal illness. Crucially, he visited Saudi this year, and the new brave stance has been taken by the king and the new crown prince of Saudi Arabia. They have promised to tackle extremism internally and abroad. This had led to Qatar being marginalized with significant sanctions imposed, including a trade and air embargo, enforced not just by Saudis, but by some significant allies in the region. This is a truly uplifting outcome in such horrific times. We must commend these 2 visionary leaders because the extremism can only be fought on the ground. It's also capped at source. In early September, King Salman ordered the establishment of an authority to scrutinize uses of the hadith, sayings, actions, or habits of the Prophet for positive use. And just a week ago in Riyadh, the Crown Prince gathered defense ministers from across the region, and he stated that we will not allow terrorists to disturb our peaceful religion and vowed to pursue terrorists until they are wiped off the face of the earth. And just a few days ago, French President Macron said that he would draw up a list of extremist organizations to convey to Saudi after its Crown Prince pledged to cut their funding. From a personal perspective, this has made me tremendously proud. I have been calling for the US and Saudi to take this stance for many years. And I have called for the West to deal with Qatar, whose money it happily takes as investment while ignoring its fellow beneficiaries. Your president has done just that, calling the country out for supporting terror and applauding the sanctions imposed by Saudi and its partner. Qatar is desperate need for partners, has made a rapprochement with Iran. This creates protection in the short term from the Saudi alliance. Turkey subsequently deployed 5,000 troops at its own military station in Qatar. France is trying to get the sanctions lifted, and Rex Tillerson has pointed out the logistical problem that the blockade has caused. But Trump and Saudi must hold firm. The Egyptian foreign minister has described Qatari funding for Islamist troops in war-torn Libya. And in May, the head of the Libyan National Army, Khalifa Haftar, described accusing Qatar of supporting terrorist groups in Libya by financing mercenaries and extremist groups. She remains a severe threat to international security. I appreciate that my focus has been on Islamism. This is not a mistake. I truly believe that this is where lurks the greatest danger to Syria in the Middle East and the world. But this does not make me a supporter of the regime, despite my surname, far from it. The key has always been and remains to find an alternative. Iraq and Libya have demonstrated that it may be easy for the West to topple the regime, but it's much more difficult to control what happens afterwards. We must plan a viable alternative, one that does not take sides in the current war between the two polar opposites, but one that represents the rest, the silent majority of Syrians I referred to earlier, that unique and wonderful mosaic of ethnicities and religions who want theocracy no more than they want dictatorship. Which is why I founded in 2011 the Organization for Democracy and Freedom in Syria, because our future must be democratic and it must be free. And by opening the franchise to all citizens, male and female, who commit to equality under the rule of law, which conveniently would rule out all Islamist groups. That is the future. And despite the desperation and tragedy of the past 6 years and the prospect more bloodshed to come, there are genuine reasons for optimism. Russia has succeeded in the region, often by pointing out to our hypocrisy, in dealing with states and groups who support the very thing that the world fears most. And had I spoken to you earlier a year ago, I would have included Saudi Arabia, whose Grand Mufti not only called for the demolition of all churches in the Arabian Peninsula, but also endorsed the Muslim Brotherhood leader's call for his followers to take up arms and kill the apostate Shias and Alawites. But the recent events present an alternative. A US president prepared to stand up to extremism, a president who has also been clear that extremists provide a great threat for global security. And let us not put Russia on too high a pedestal. They have no intentions of paying for the reconstruction of Syria, and they will not let a national unity government form unless they have a large say in the formation of the opposition. And this is our next challenge, because the question of what next looms ever closer. Once Putin and Trump have driven ISIS from the battlefield, there will be an opportunity for dialogue and to form a national unity government. And this process has already become a game of charades. The Russians are pulling the strings. First, they announced that they would host a conference of the so-called Syrian Congress in Sochi at the end of November. This was intended to gather the regime, their proxy opposition groups, and those vetted by Russia. Invitations were sent to 1,000 participants who were invited to pay their own way. The real motivations there was to pressure the Syrian National Coalition and their EU backers to accept the new deal orchestrated by Russia with the agreement of the US, Saudi, Iran, and Turkey. The EU was furious and said that if the Sochi deal bypassed its own Geneva conference and their preferred Syrian coalition, it would refuse to contribute financially to Syrian reconstruction. Simultaneously, Russia and Saudi gathered all opposition groups, including the Syrian National Coalition and those pro the regime, but excluding all elements of the Qatari-backed Muslim Brotherhood. The Turks, of course, agreed as long as the Kurds were not invited. The outcome was a proposed group of 36, only 8 of whom represented the interest of the previous opposition, in the form of the Syrian National Coalition. And this is newly formed delegation is the one sitting now in Geneva having dialogue with the Syrian regime with the blessing of the EU. That now feels they have not been that now the EU feels they have not been completely marginalized. Meanwhile, 2 crucial and representative factions are left completely unrepresented: the Kurds and the UNDA, the oldest and largest opposition party in Syria from before 1984. Too moderate for either side in this game of international realpolitik. The most likely outcome right now is a coalition that includes the regime and its President Assad, backed by Iran and Russia, with the US being told to withdraw under international law, and it has not been invited by the government. This would bring back northern Syria under the control of the regime, with the Kurds marginalized, as President Trump has assured President Erdogan that the US will no longer arm them. And with the Turks inside Syria's Idlib province, the Kurds would be completely surrounded by Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Turkey, all of whom have good reason to destroying them. This is clearly wrong. The Kurds should be represented as equal citizens of Syria. They are a fundamental part of Syria's beautiful mosaic that I have already described. This is a one-off opportunity to create a representative opposition, open to any group, as long as it commits to equality of all citizens under the rule of law. And that must be our only goal. It is inherent if this inherent division of Syria is ever to end. I apologize if some of my arguments have been laden heavily with detail. My aim is to prove that there is an inarguable substance behind them, that the West has been culpable of many mistakes in the Middle East, many of which have had a ghastly impact on Syria, but that there is an alternative, and that after years of making speeches to government think tanks and democracy groups, I feel that events are taking a turn for the better, albeit within a context of global aggression that needs to be tempered, at least until the biggest war of them all is won by the Middle East and surrounding areas. We must cease to believe that we can resolve the issues of the region by deposing tyrants and then hoping for the best. We must work with allies new and old to shape a new democracy, to seek solutions not just for Syria but for Iraq too, including a federal system if that would keep these countries united. We are gathered within the greatest federal solution of them all, and your democracy has stood the test of time. Whatever happens, we are in fact witnessing a new Sykes-Picot across the Middle East, but this time it's not colonial powers who are shaping the borders and frontiers, but the people of the Middle East themselves. Unfortunately, they are doing it on sectarian, religious, and ethnic grounds. But they cannot blame the bloody consequences on conspiracies and foreign interventions. They can only blame themselves. There has been no shortage of more stable, wealthier, bigger powers looking to use their involvement in Syria to feather their own nest. Iran, Turkey, and the Gulf state have all done so, often in the mistaken belief that they will be left to carve out their own future influence. In fact, there is another tier of interest, bigger, wealthier, and more powerful, looking out for itself. The US and Russia have vested interest across the region and beyond, and ultimately they answer to their own public back home. They know that popularity is rarely won through foreign policy, but through the economic benefits that accrue. Which is why, although I implore the US to act in a certain way, I do not ask you to take responsibility for our future. It is time for the people of the Middle East, my people, to take responsibility for our own destiny. Religious, sectarian, ethnic, and tribal divisions only take us in one direction. It is bloody and catastrophic. Only by embracing each other and standing up to those who will not do so can we create a better way. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I would like to open it up now for some questions. Do we have questions here that you were saying would like to ask?